idea that the drug laws that we have are based on risk are completely and utterly false. They go completely against any data that we have on that. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you are pretty guaranteed to see some negative effects of alcohol. If you smoke a lot of cannabis, you're not guaranteed to see that. So what is that difference? There are certain genome profiles that seem to predispose people to be more at risk for developing psychosis. It's not just genetics. There's a trauma profile that can be associated. Potentially things like pollution could be contributing. Socioeconomic things are huge contributors as well. If you have a lot of other risk factors, genetic, socioeconomic, plus you're smoking a lot of very high THC cannabis, then you are at risk that you could be tipping into this. Now, how can people know? I think
Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley is a neuroscientist and leading psychedelics researcher. She's published on cannabis, psychosis risk, and psychedelics for women. She's led research with the Heroic Hearts Project, watching combat veterans radically transform their lives through psychedelic retreats in places like the Amazon rainforest. But what is the current state of psychedelic research? Why are highly effective drug treatments still restricted? And why the hell do people need to go to the middle of a rainforest to get the help they desperately need? This episode is in collaboration with Neuroscience, an incredible research charity near and dear to my heart, led by Professor David Nutt, attempting to tell the truth about drugs. Subscribe if this is important to you and before your endogenous endocannabinoids wear off and your amygdala changes its mind.
I've had the absolute pleasure of having a front row seat with my role at Heroic Hearts Project to watch military veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder go through a number of different psychedelic retreats, and it really is unbelievable in terms of seeing that transformation that it has, and long-lasting. You know, with some of the depression trials now, they've now shown that there is extreme resilience in terms of the change in depression scores for years following the study, which is really amazing.
Dr. Grace Blest-Hopley. Studies are showing that daily cannabis use has surpassed daily alcohol use for the first time in the US. I'm curious if you think that's a good thing or not.
Wow, that's a very good question. I mean, I think we know that the dangers of alcohol are pretty ubiquitous across all people who consume alcohol, and there's certainly very high correlations that have been proven out with its links with cancer, liver disease, you know, various other disorders, as well as its effect on sleep and mental health. So I definitely believe that alcohol is a serious poison, but I most certainly believe that there are dangerous aspects to cannabis as well. So although I do believe that cannabis is probably safer in many regards, that is not true for everybody. We do know that there are some risk factors to cannabis use as well as its benefits, and those need to be taken into account. I guess, you know, we're kind of alluding a little on, you know, what I did in my PhD, which was to really look into cannabis use and look at the effects of cannabis use, particularly in adolescents and on developing brains, and how that might be attributed to changes in cognitive performance, but also the development of mental health disorders like psychosis and schizophrenia particularly. What we saw within those studies and what's been done in many other studies is finding sort of causal links there that do seem to exist, where a lot of cannabis use, particularly in this particular age range, can affect things like neuronal pruning, where our brain goes through the process of essentially becoming more efficient and setting up the networks that it needs in order to, you know, do executive functioning and switch focus and memory consolidation and recall, all of this. And if we use a lot of cannabis during that time, then there's evidence to suggest that that could be impacted later on in our lives. But when we look at cannabis users, particularly in adulthood, although we do see, you know, the acute effects of cannabis impairing people's cognition in some ways and their ability to perform certain tasks, the risk in terms of its risk to our mental health is far reduced during those stages. So if we think of something like people's daily use of cannabis versus alcohol, which is mostly happening when people are a little older, as you know, when people are not predisposed to have psychotic disorders, for instance, or have negative reactions to cannabis. I would argue it is safer than daily alcohol use. Is that enough
Yeah.
of an answer?
No, it's a great answer. It's a really good overview. And I think we're going to get into all of the different nuances. But I wanted to start with that because it is such an interesting cultural trend at the moment that it seems like newer generations are putting the alcohol down and they're maybe smoking a little bit more. But if they're substituting that, then that might be good on balance. But there's a lot of nuance to be had in that discussion about how we can do that in ways to minimize harm, when the right times to do that is, the right concentrations of THC, right? It's very hard to have a meaningful conversation about cannabis as one drug because THC versus CBD percentages obviously just make it a completely different substance most of the time. There's nuance in smoking versus vaping versus edible. So I just wanted to have a really nuanced discussion here about if people are doing it, that encompasses a bunch of things culturally, but like what are the ways that people could minimize harm? What are the certain scenarios where harm is most likely? You mentioned probably one of the most important ones is links with psychosis and schizophrenia. Maybe let's start there.
Yeah.
Is it only certain subgroups, subpopulations of people that need to worry about that? Either you're predisposed or you're not. Let's just talk in general about the links between cannabis and psychosis, schizophrenia.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the evidence that we have around that is obviously being collected in sort of epidemiological studies where we've looked across whole populations and tried to kind of see where those links might be. And some of the sort of most convincing work, I suppose, that's been done looking at rates of psychosis across various different places within Europe and looking at various other lifestyle factors, including cannabis use, what they found was most associated with higher rates of psychosis was higher rates of THC, so hydrocannabidiol, which is the active component of cannabis. And with this, they found that higher rates were associated with more people developing psychosis. So that gives you the initial thought, well, could this be that higher rates of THC are causing this? Now, when we look at the acute effects of THC compared to things like CBD, which is the other main cannabinoid in cannabis, which is non-psychoactive, we find that from a neurofunctioning level, we see these psychomimetic effects coming about from THC. So they're inducing what look more like the symptoms of psychosis, whereas with something like CBD, we see the opposite. We see almost like an antipsychotic effect with this. So from looking at these two different, bits of data and a lot of other research has gone on in this, and also looking at the patients who come in with psychosis and what are their behaviors that are perhaps associated with them developing this. And it's very, very common that heavy cannabis use is within that profile, particularly, in places like London and, where I did my research at King's College London. And so it is from that we kind of associate the risks. Now, we've been able to look further into like how this might be, because we know that there are, like I said to you, with alcohol, if you drink a lot of alcohol, you are pretty guaranteed to see some of the negative effects of alcohol. If you smoke a lot of cannabis, you're not guaranteed to see that. So what is that difference? And we've been able to now look at sort of genetic studies, and there are certain genome profiles that seem to predispose people to be more at risk for developing psychosis. There's also a lot of other things that go into psychosis. It's not just genetics. There's a trauma profile that can be associated with the development of psychosis. There's other things that can be associated in terms of our environment. Potentially things like pollution could be contributing. Other things and socioeconomic things are huge contributors as well. And when we think about psychosis, we have to think about it in a way that it's almost there's a threshold level in terms of how much sort of risk factors we can take before we would tip over this threshold and develop a psychotic disorder. And cannabis makes up sort of one of the things that can contribute in that. So if you have a lot of other risk factors, genetic, socioeconomic, other behaviors, plus you're smoking a lot of very high THC cannabis, then you are at risk that you could be tipping into this. Now, how can people know? I think, you know in your own kind of family history, if there's been histories of things like psychosis, psychosis. And also there are kind of other ways that you can determine. There's been a lot of scales that have been developed that start to tease apart some of these things and help people to identify where people might be in a pre-psychotic disorder, so a period of high risk that they could transition to full psychosis within a few years. So yeah, all of these things are kind of what should be considered. And from what I found with my work, the age of which you are smoking is important. And that's some of the hardest part with cannabis, because if we look at the average age that people start smoking cannabis, and if we look at what the adolescent brain is, it's built to take risks and, be an adolescent, right? It's the time when we are most likely to develop these risk-taking behaviors like use of cannabis. And we know that it's probably one of the riskiest times to do it in terms of our brain going through these neurological processes to restructure itself ready for adulthood. And we are directly impacting the endocannabinoid system, which is a regulatory system that is playing a huge role within this pruning that goes on.
Really good answer. Well, what age do you think is the right age to start? If you had your magic wand and you were creating legislation on cannabis consumption in the country, like what is the age where you can start feeling better about starting to consume cannabis in a not harm-free, but less harmful way?
Yeah, well, a difficult one. I mean, we are starting to realize we're not kind of fully forming in the, most kind of developed parts of our prefrontal cortex until we're nearly 25 years of age, which
Right.
it's actually, quite old if we compare that to what we'd have in terms of sort of when we can drive, when we can vote, when we can, make these other decisions in our lives. I think, 25 really is sort of the endpoint of which what we know around development of prefrontal cortex. And a lot of that early neuronal pruning that I'm talking about happens more at the front end of adolescence. So sort of 12, 13, 14, 15. And as we sort of, get into the latter part of adolescence, less so. I'm not sure I could say there's a specific age at which you should suddenly start smoking cannabis, but certainly, avoiding the particularly very early parts of adolescence and staying kind of away from any behaviors that can put very heavy attribution on heavy weight onto the reward system is probably a good idea, or interfering sort of majorly with how different neurotransmitter systems of the brain are working by taking any psychoactive substance.
2025 is the year that me and you are going to fix our sleep. Now, that does not mean that we need to go full Brian Johnson on it, but one thing we can do that's super easy is to buy the highest quality sleep mask on the market, and that is Manta. I've been blown away by how much better I sleep with one of these on. It's just a fact that people are not sleeping in completely dark environments, and studies show that affects sleep quality, time to get to sleep, and increases the fragmentation of your sleep. I have tried other sleep masks. I first bought one on Amazon last year for like €5, but the problem is they're just really poor quality. They don't really block out any of the light, and you can't adjust them to your planet-sized head. Manta is fully adjustable, so it literally will fit all of the strangest and weirdest size heads out there, like mine. The Manta mask is literally completely blackout. I have studio lights coming at me from here, and I can't tell the difference. It is absolutely pitch black. This is the perfect environment that you need for sleep. Manta honestly feels like you're being cuddled by a cloud. I actively enjoy and look forward to putting these on each night. I just realized how boring that makes my life sound. I sleep with Manta every single night, and I've seen direct improvements in the quality, duration, and how rested I feel when I wake up. My Whoop data seems to agree. Manta have a bunch of different sleep masks on their website. I have tried the normal sleep mask as well as the sound mask. I like to listen to audiobooks at night, so for that reason, the sound mask was actually really, really good. For some reason, my girlfriend doesn't want to listen to how reality is a perception at 11 o'clock when we're trying to sleep. So this was a really good solution for that. It's also incredibly comfortable. But as I said, I think for most people, like 90% of people, the normal ordinary mask is going to fill their requirements. Super comfortable and completely adjustable.
Literally is just a really high quality, well made product. It's the best on the market. Manta are giving my viewers 10% off their first sleep mask. They ship internationally and they also offer a 60-day free trial. That's 59 of the best nights of sleep you've ever had. I literally promise that. But if for any reason you aren't satisfied, you will get your money back, no questions asked. I really couldn't recommend more if you're looking to do something to improve your sleep. A sleep mask is the lowest hanging fruit. It's so simple and easy to apply, and I think it will benefit your life and overall health, and I could not recommend Manta more.
Do you imagine any world, and this might be a bit sci-fi, but say 5-10 years down the line, where we're going into our dispensary in the middle of London and we get our brains scanned, and in the dispensary right there they make the judgment of, actually, your you might be 22 but your prefrontal cortex looks a little bit more like a 19-year-old, you need a few more years. But then another person would come in and they'd be 19 but their prefrontal cortex is a lot more developed. Since there's so much variance in that distribution, and that might be one of the biggest reducers of harm, do you ever imagine this like personalized medicine world where people are able to access it at different times based on their own brain chemistry?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's personalized medicine and there's whatever sci-fi nightmare that is. But
Yeah.
I think in order for us to do that, I mean, maybe with the advent of what we can now do with large data sets and different kind of ability to do these calculations much more efficiently than we were able to, maybe we could. But when we're looking at somebody's brain, it's actually really difficult to have what we would call like, oh, here's where we know you're done, and we would have to get to that. We would have to look at people in a longitudinal manner to see whether we continue to see those changes within their brain or not. So maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll start having some kind of government brain functioning database where they track us and how we're getting along. But yeah, I think there could
I
be.
didn't sign up for that. That's not what I. That is
Well,
not what I said.
they could start saying it for a lot of different things, right? If you're not allowed to
Yeah,
make the choice to smoke cannabis, they say, oh, actually, I'm not sure your prefrontal cortex is developed enough to vote in the next election. Or
yeah, exactly. Right. There's a lot of dystopian avenues there.
and also, would they then say, if we start going off the other end, we started to notice a decline in your functioning, we're now going to start removing your rights. You've started all sorts of a thought experiment here now.
Right. Because I was reading and I found it very interesting. Apparently, the links with schizophrenia and cannabis consumption is not found everywhere. So apparently schizophrenia cases linked to cannabis use disorder, sort of 3 to 4 times increase over 2 decades in Denmark. So case studies done in the last 20 years in Denmark. But in Ontario, apparently post-legalization, schizophrenia has stayed stable. So I'm curious what you think about that. Why would we get sort of similar consumption patterns in different major cities, but not necessarily linked schizophrenia cases? Is there populations that you think could be protected genetically speaking? Is it sociocultural in those areas? Is it a mix of both, like it usually always is? But I'm curious because that was very interesting to find that because you would expect, Canada was one of those countries that went very pro cannabis legalization quite quickly. They popped up everywhere. Consumption definitely increased, but it seems like schizophrenia stayed stable. I was curious of what you would think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure which studies that you are quoting, because I have seen other studies that have come out of Canada that have shown, changes in psychosis levels, and it varies depending on like the methodology of how people have been tested and what populations they're testing. In some regard, if it's people that were smoking from before the change in law or not. Also, just in terms of, like you alluded to, that there is potentially some effect of the cannabis supply itself, exactly what it is, if it's very high THC cannabis flower that's being smoked as opposed to, a formulated cannabis product or something that is more balanced in terms of its cannabinoid profile, for instance. Although the evidence behind sort of cannabinoid profiles and how they attribute to the development of psychosis, again, is still quite new. We do our best as scientists to try and work out what we can from what data we're able to collect. But when we're dealing with illicit substances like this, and the same transfers over to like the psychedelic world even, and people are using these things in very much underground ways, or we have these medicinal access rights in certain areas, but without any kind of registries to fully follow people through the program, it becomes really difficult to formulate studies that can be definitive in terms of understanding the effects.
I always thought it would be so hard as a cannabis researcher to parse apart like the lifestyle interventions that people who smoke a lot would tend to engage in, you know, sort of not very active. They would maybe smoke early in the day and just kind of sit on the couch eating, you know, rubbish food, watching TV. And like teasing that apart from someone who has a very, you know, a good work-life balance, has a social circle, exercises a lot, reads a lot, sleeps well, you know, like how much of those negative effects of
Absolutely.
cannabis can be reduced with really strong lifestyles in place.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And one of the things I wanted to say, back when you asked me your initial question, any behavior can be problematic if it's done in the wrong way, be it alcohol use, cannabis use, going to the gym, junk food, all of these things. If they're not done in the right way and they're not integrated into a holistic and balanced lifestyle, then they can become problematic. And I think that's definitely the case with cannabis. And I think we do know of the medicinal value of cannabis. Also, I think people are allowed to have a good time, right? People are allowed to relax. People are allowed to engage in behaviors that are pretty safe, to be honest, on the whole of things. So I definitely don't think that people should never use these substances. But I think you're definitely hitting on something there, and it was something I touched upon when I was thinking about my PhD and how I was writing about adolescent cannabis users and their outcomes, particularly thinking about things like memory performance and school attainment and stuff like that. And there is this secondary effect, when you are smoking cannabis all the time, there can be various different things, i.e. sometimes the people that you are with, or sometimes the behaviors that you're engaging with them mean you're not like doing your schoolwork. You then don't go and do your further education. You then don't, move on, get a good job. And all these things then add to those other stressors that can increase your risk. Now, It's very interesting. I had a discussion with quite a prominent psychosis research, and we were talking about cannabis within adolescence and it as a risk factor. And he actually pointed out to me that perhaps in some way there is a protective value of being a cannabis user in your adolescence, in that it's very rare that when you're getting into cannabis, you don't get into it alone. It often is indicative of having quite a strong social set that you are associated with. And we know that things like that are really beneficial to us, to have strong social bonds around us. So there is, as I say, the negative effects that mean you are, perhaps not engaging with certain work and aspects in the way that you should be. And if you're smoking cannabis all the time, then obviously that's going to become problematic. But if you're engaging in a way, particularly where you're being social with it and you're, using it in moderation, then there's, definitely ways that it's not going to be a net negative to your overall life and well-being.
Right. I'm really curious how you as a researcher think we can solve that problem, because it can be so hard for a random person to see a study, oh, cannabis is associated with a 4 times increase in schizophrenia, whatever it is, and then think, whoa, that's a really huge deal. I'm not going to have my 1 joint per month, which is definitely not the kind of consumption that is correlated with the 4 times, So like, how do we parse apart someone's lifestyle so that an individual can make the claim or figure out for themselves what would the harm be for them having, 1 joint on the weekend versus, 3 pints or 4 pints? And it can be extremely hard because those lifestyle factors aren't teased apart. You have someone exercises 10 hours per week versus doesn't at all. Like, that's going to have a huge impact. Someone who's smoking high THC strains right before bed and disrupting their sleep versus someone who is, aware of that and trying to smoke earlier in the day so that it's kind of worn off. There's just so many mitigating factors here, so many different complexities. And I think all of that nuance is kind of removed a lot of the time in the research, whereas people just see these headlines and it kind of scares them into, oh God, I can't ever try that.
Well, absolutely. And that's because we have a huge problem with how we report on a lot of science. And what
Yeah,
happens is, we academics sit there and write these very sort of detailed and intricate papers that are, pretty undecipherable to the layman. And then they're picked up by journalists who take the one little bit and run with it. And you're like,
yeah,
that's not really what the study said. And we've seen the incredible damage that's done across all sort of waves of science, and particularly in medicine. So, always take everything that you read, if it's in any kind of journalistic publication, with a pinch of salt. Is got to be the way kind of forward, I think. But also, you're talking really about people who are very health conscious, people really who are engaging with their lives. And we've never been more rich in our ability in order to access information and to have information delivered to us in a way that is digestible, with the advent of AI and
yeah,
things.
yeah,
Obviously, I know there are huge problems with the hallucinations and all the rest of it. And it can only go off what's been said before. And a lot of what's been said before might not be true. But we are in a position where we can kind of advocate for ourselves. And I think, I obviously do an awful lot of work in psychedelic science as well as cannabis science. And, within that field, when we talk to people about how they might want to engage with those kind of medicines, it really comes from a conversation with yourself first before anybody else. And I think we do know, when our use for something is particularly problematic. I think for people who are very nervous because of these headlines that they see, I think we do have a lot of evidence now with the legalization and sort of medicinally medicinal recognition for cannabis in various different places across the globe, that this isn't like a major risk factor for everybody that uses cannabis.
yeah.
The first times that people do use cannabis, actually, people can find it quite unpleasant. And we do know that there are some people that it just really is not nice for them and they don't like it. So, I think there has to be, a willingness to try and experiment and see, what your tolerance is for it, and how you might want to engage with it. But then I think, on the same guard as that, if you do want to move over to using something like cannabis, it is important to think about how you titrate yourself onto a medicine like that, and setting limits in terms of your use. And so you can sort of have the checks and balances in place to recognize if you think that your use is going beyond something that you are then comfortable with.
Yeah.
And that's really important. We sometimes are quick to dismiss the addictive potential of cannabis and cannabis use disorder, but it most certainly is a thing. And there are people out there who really do struggle with problematic cannabis use. It's more likely to occur in people that start using cannabis heavily in their adolescence. That's the profile that people are more likely to. So again, if you are somebody over the age of 25 who wants to start trying cannabis, your risks are fairly low that it's going to be problematic, but they're not zero. But they're
Yeah.
not with anything.
Do you think that the governments in respective countries, Ireland, the UK, wherever you are, have really not done a very good job at educating the public about how to consume cannabis? I've really
They've
thought
done
this
a
for a
terrible job.
while. Yeah, I've really thought this for a while. This strategy they have of maybe if we just don't tell them about it, they won't do it. I think that's a preposterously ridiculous strategy, and they need to invest more in educating people about how to consume cannabis properly, how to understand the difference between THC and CBD, how it affects sleep, how it affects these different things, because you really cannot, I believe, as you've said as well, mitigate a lot of the damage you're going to do if you just know a few basic things. And I think the government could have done better in educating general population on how to consume cannabis.
I mean, forget about educating the general population. They don't even educate doctors and physicians or
Yes.
themselves.
Yes.
So it's a
Which is
systemic
wild.
problem. Yeah, that unfortunately, it is slightly different. I don't know if you know, but Donald Trump actually tweeted, or whatever whatever medium he uses to publish his thoughts and ideas. But he actually published a video about the endocannabinoid system and cannabis and how it could be potentially useful in old age populations, which was quite surprising. But I'm sure we'll find out there's some lobbying act behind it at some point. But
Right.
there are various, different levels of engagement across different jurisdictions in terms of cannabis education. Now, in terms of the UK and Ireland, it's not been particularly forthcoming. We don't see the endocannabinoid system included on just sort of standard education and physiology for our doctors. We certainly don't see it at A level or GCSE, even though we know the endocannabinoid system in itself is, ubiquitous throughout our body. There's various different receptors. It impacts various different things, from brain function to immunity to digestion. So it's remarkable that we don't include it in those regards. So we definitely do need more education. Now, when it comes to education around the prescribability and what we're able to potentially use these drugs for, now that's where it's particularly interesting. So we don't actually have the data to say, oh, well, cannabis is good for this or that, other than the very, very few cannabis-based drug products that exist. So things like Epidiolex, for instance, which is based around cannabidiol, CBD. It's a very high potent form and it's used for childhood epilepsy. Now, there are very, very few other drug products made of cannabinoids that exist for any particular indication. But what we do have is we have cannabis and cannabinoid based drug products that are allowed to be prescribed for a variety of different disorders. Now, they are off-label. So what that means is that a consultant who is a specialist within a particular area can prescribe you off-label cannabis for whatever it is. Now, for some things, there is reasonably good evidence that exists through academic research that's gone on and case studies and small clinical trials, not nearly enough data to license a drug, but small clinical trials from which people base these decisions. But there are also sort of, ones where there's less evidence and perhaps people shouldn't be being prescribed, cannabis for some things. Now, what that means is that you can't actually say, oh, cannabis use for insomnia, cannabis use for chronic pain. You can't advertise in any way as a cannabis clinic that this is what they are for, because they're not licensed for it. It has to come from consultation. So there's a lot of strange reasons. Plus, you're absolutely right. The government doesn't want to engage in it. It could change these rules. It could engage with clinics. It could do an awful lot in order to engage the cannabis sector and the medicinal cannabis sector in order to deliver this better to patients who really could get a lot of benefit, but also clean it up so that people who are using this as a pseudo way to get cannabis for recreational use would not be able to. But they are terrified of the subject because it's drugs, right? And drugs
Why
are really.
do you think that is? Why do you think that is? Why is there just this huge systemic institutional oppression and repression of psychedelics, of cannabis, of these new age substances? What is that? And it seems to be like pretty consistent over decades of these major institutions just not wanting people to have access to these, even though they have better trial data for lots of different things that we'll get into in loads of different, psychotherapy type protocols. There's so much good evidence that they can have a lot of good, but for some reason there's just this constant, no, we can't have that. We need to just keep drinking old boy alcohol, and that's the only thing you can have.
Exactly. Well, it's because they don't really know what to do, right? This is all built on historical legislation that has been kind of coming for years, that is based on sort of what our cultural norms were thought to be, religious pressures, agricultural pressures, racial pressures that have led to the buildup of what we currently have in terms of our illegal drug legislation. But a lot of it, I believe, comes from, an unwillingness to do this because of a kind of squeamishness to test where public opinion really is. And people are very kind of reluctant to go against what the status quo is, particularly when they're looking for re-election, right? When they don't want to turn people against them. But I think there's also, as I say, just a lot of this idea that to revisit the drug laws in a way that was sensible, to actually look at the data and the evidence, and to rewrite how we communicate risk through our law. You know, the idea that the drug laws that we have are based on risk are completely and utterly false. They go completely against any data that we have on that. And so that, you know, that it would really, really rock the boat. And in terms of how that could affect, you know, world order, when we think of, you know, what effects we have on the world from, you know, crime and the ecological level from the illegal drugs trade, you know, it would be something that would be amazing to be able to impact by looking at the risks of these different substances and treating adults as adults and allowing them to access these substances safely, would mean that we would kind of change things an awful lot. And I think, you know, a lot of politicians are just not, you know, able to perhaps engage with what that might mean on their watch anyway. I think we are very slowly seeing like the trickles of this get into politicians and them start to understand the medicinal benefit of this, the economic benefit of this, you know, what the impact could be in terms of changing culture. But it's going to take a huge movement for enough of them to get behind it, you know.
Yeah.
No one wants, I think, the wrong side of history. And I think being the first mover feels a bit like you might be that.
Right. But it's sort of cowardice. It seems like cowardice, at least in my view. No one has blown my mind on this more than David Nutt. Just going through all of the different examples of the sheer level of corruption and insanity of these governments, not just creating policy to make it accessible, but actively stopping people who need it for medicinal treatment in cases of, you know, refractory epilepsy, where it seems like cannabis is like the only treatment or the best treatment for reducing seizures in young boys and young girls. And there's, you know, cases of the UK government like trying to actively stop them getting that access. It seems it's completely wild to me. You know, we joked that, you know, we would reduce MDMA harm massively in colleges if we just told them that they should drink water every hour. Like that just extremely basic levels of education that seem obvious could massively reduce harm. But the strategy is consistently like pull the wool over their eyes. Maybe they'll stop doing all drugs except alcohol, which there's no evidence that's better, and it's almost certainly worse. It's just it's completely backwards to me and so weird.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, like you say, there are certain people who perhaps have sort of spent their entire careers working on drug policy and how they're going to reduce drug use. And, you know, those people are now still in very senior positions, and it's very difficult to turn around and look at your entire life's work and say, maybe this was all wrong. Maybe that I should have done something different. Or maybe I could have saved more lives. And we do have evidence, right, that, you know, the sort of strength of the law bears very little resemblance on what drug use is actually taking place. So it's kind of ridiculous that any of their policies have taken effect. But until those people sort of move out of those positions, and I've had those conversations myself, and as you've heard from this conversation, I'm not all in or all out. You know, I believe in the medicinal power of these substances, but I also believe that there is a lot of safeguarding that needs to be done, and sometimes problematic use that can be fallen into with them. But you know, the times that you speak to people who will not hear you know, black and white evidence because it stands against what they've believed for so long. And unfortunately, that's just human nature, really. And not everybody is so enlightened as to be able to change their mind these days.
I feel like it's the entire reason that we hire politicians is in theory, and this is clearly not represented in the real world, but to have the guts to come out and make change when the overwhelming level of evidence for decades has been that, you know, mushrooms are really not going to cause society to implode, but they're still just impossible to access. That's just wild to me. It's crazy.
Something that always strikes me when I talk to neuroscientists is just how staggeringly complex the brain really is. It's this incredible prediction engine, always trying to make sense of the world and keep us safe. But it's important to remember we're still running ape hardware. Our brains weren't even remotely built for the chaos of modern life. And sometimes they just get scrambled. I've recently had some difficulty in my own personal life, and I realized that it was about time my own ape prediction system got the gym workout and just rebalancing that it's probably needed for quite a long time. So I booked my first therapy session with BetterHelp, who I'm incredibly excited to be partnering with on this video. A massive umbrella review of hundreds of randomized control trials found that nearly every meta-analysis of psychotherapy favored it over control conditions. In other words, mental health professionals from decades of research consistently find that talking therapies do actually work. BetterHelp is an entirely online therapy platform designed to make that process incredibly simple. You can connect with a licensed therapist from your home on your schedule through video, audio, or even text with literally no fuss at all. What I like about it is that you can switch therapists at any time until you find someone who you personally can build rapport with and open up to, which is such a critical part of therapy, at no extra cost. If you've ever thought about trying therapy, or you're just feeling a little bit stuck in your own head lately like I was, this might be a great first step that I really couldn't recommend more. Visit betterhelp.com/giantshoulder to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp/giantshoulder, and in doing so, you also support the channel. Links are down below, because sometimes the most powerful way to understand your own brain is just to talk about it.
One thing I wanted to get your opinion on is the MDMA rejection by the FDA. This was a bit of a surprise, at least for people when I was talking to people that were familiar with this. It was a shock that it was rejected. Could you maybe lay some context for this? I'd love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So the program was using MDMA as a way to as a substance to use during psychotherapy in people with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was conducted via MAPS, who've been around since the 80s under the leadership of Rick Doblin. And they were a non-profit organization who really had a lot of focus to try and bring research back to psychedelics based off of, all of the psychedelic research getting shut down by that time. And they were able to raise enough money to run some phase 2 clinical trials and then 2 phase 3 trials, which is usually the requirement for the FDA, which is the American version of the MHRA, which are both the regulatory bodies that sit for the US and the UK respectively, for regulating drugs and giving out those licenses that I spoke about in the cannabis space. And what happened was they completed these studies and they handed the data in, but there was a review by the FDA wherein they decided that the data was not sufficient enough, and there were enough concerns that they had with the program that they were going to need to see some more data, but they hadn't yet decided exactly what that form might be. Now, a lot of what they were saying was that there was inconsistencies in the way that the trial was run, in the way that the therapy was delivered, and that this potentially had affected the data in terms of its validity across sort of testing the same therapy, if that makes sense. And also they had some issues with the unblinding effect, which I'm sure if any of you have had any experience of taking a substance like MDMA, you know that it's a psychoactive substance for which you become quite aware that there's been a change in your body and your mindset.
Is going to be the gig is going to be up quite soon.
Exactly right. And so it was very difficult for them to maintain a blind, which we usually use in clinical trials, where we would give half of the group the active substance and half of the group a placebo. So, a sugar pill, for instance, to see if the active substance itself was responsible for the improvement. Now, it was very disappointing when that happened for a lot of the psychedelic kind of world. This was going to be a real watershed moment in terms of the first kind of psychedelic assisted therapy being licensed for post-traumatic stress disorder. However, I think it is prudent that we uphold the standards that we do have in terms of licensing drugs for use across the population. So although I also was disappointed and I would like to see, these drugs kind of moving forward towards licensing, I think there were legitimate concerns that the FDA had in some of the conduct from the ways that the clinical trials had been run. Now, there's more conversations ongoing, and I do believe that data will still be contributing towards a license, but there are perhaps some more things that that company, which has now become a separate biotech company, Lycos Therapeutics, will have to address in order to get the license. Now, I know it's not always a popular opinion to say, okay, well, this should have just been waved through, but I think it's really important. And a lot of the work I do in psychedelics is talking about, where there is missing data and is not fully understanding, particularly in my case, I look at women's health and how women's cycles, for instance, and are not properly investigated in understanding psychedelic therapies. And I think it's important. These are extremely powerful substances. They are going to be transformative and life-changing for people. And that needs to be kind of well thought out when we think about how we roll it out into larger clinical models and making sure that they are safe and that we have kind of effective labels on our drugs so that we know how to use them properly.
I understand that. That's a mature researcher answer. What do you think the best evidence says on MDMA's efficacy for PTSD? Because I was under the understanding it's very strong in general in research.
Yeah, no, doubtably. I think it works. I think MDMA for PTSD works. I think that psilocybin, ayahuasca, a number of different psychedelics work for this. And I've had the absolute pleasure of having a front row seat with my role at Heroic Hearts Project to watch military veterans who have post-traumatic stress disorder go through a number of different psychedelic retreats. And it really is unbelievable in terms of seeing that transformation that it has and long lasting. I know it's not PTSD, but with some of the depression trials now that they did back at Imperial College a number of years ago, they've now shown that there is extreme resilience in terms of the change in depression scores for years following the study, which is really amazing. And I'm excited to kind of see that happen when it comes to clinic. But, part of my role involves speaking to the FDA about clinical trials. And unfortunately, they are a very stringent body in terms of what they require. And perhaps we do need to look at the way that we accept certain data around particularly drugs like this because of the very known effects that confound keeping a blind in placebo. And also because of the incredible amount of real world evidence that we've been able to collect from people going to retreats and things. How can we use that in supporting taking drugs forward to license? There's a number of other companies, I think, who are now in phase 3 trials who I believe will get their
so it's just a matter of time, you think? That there was some issues with the way this trial was conducted, but the bulk of evidence is just there that it will just take the right clinical trial to push it through.
Absolutely. And I don't think anyone can legitimately argue that the reason that the MDMA was not licensed for PTSD was because it didn't work, because that just really is, there's so much evidence contrary to that and actually showing it really works very well. That's not the case. And the same again with treatment-resistant depression and major depressive disorder. We've just seen again this morning another FDA breakthrough therapy designation given to a biotech company for treatment-resistant depression using a 5-MeO DMT, which is a very, very short-acting, very powerful psychedelic for treatment-resistant depression. So we have got really good engagement from the FDA in terms of their willingness to see these programs advance. And that's not the only program that has breakthrough therapy, breakthrough designation or fast-track designation. And what these things mean is it means that you can get enhanced engagement with the agency, with the FDA, so you can actually speed up your development plan. So they are engaged. They do want to help these programs get the data that they need for them to be able to say yes.
Yeah. I saw that one of the rejection criteria that the FDA gave was that they didn't properly document that there was euphoria caused by the MDMA. I was listening to, are you familiar with Hamilton Morris? He created I think one of the best documentary series on psychedelics called Hamilton Morris's Pharmacopoeia, and he goes around to South America and smoking fish heads and licking toad venoms and all of this, but he's really, really good. He's very, very good. He's a good journalist, and he's made, I think, the best documentaries on psychedelics. But he was talking about this FDA trial, and one of the reasons that they gave that they rejected it was that they didn't document the euphoria of MDMA. And I kind of thought, it's like
Yeah, as a side
everyone,
effect. Yeah.
yeah, it's like, yeah, I get why it's maybe a bit strange why they didn't, but like everyone knows that MDMA gives. It's like, is that not the most obvious point? And to use it as a rejection criteria when there's such good evidence it works seems really weird to me. I don't know. Maybe
Yeah,
the trial wasn't
absolutely.
conducted perfectly, but if it's overwhelmingly good data and there's people there that need it, it just seems a bit criminal to me not to give it to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for cases like this, it does seem, in a sort of common sense position to think, well, that's
Right.
ridiculous, of course. But, the way that clinical trials are run are, unbelievable. And if they weren't run like that, there would be a sort of outcry. If people were just sort of like, not really reporting things properly and not thoroughly across all symptom ranges, then people would have those issues. And so,
Yeah.
of course, I think it is, very obvious that those would be side effects. But I can sort of get why they were like, well, they needed to be in there, otherwise the data set isn't complete. The
Yeah.
validity of data sets being complete, even if the
I
piece of data
understand that.
that's missing is not really very relevant, it calls into it calls into
I do
question the whole
understand that.
data sets. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's you know these things are worse than the worst forms of accounting, collecting data in clinical trials. They are
I'm sure.
extremely, extremely anal in their detail
Yeah.
and thoroughness.
I know another aspect that just seemed really cruel to me is I just finished watching a documentary series on the Vietnam War. And like the American government basically just lied to their country for like a number of years and sent hundreds of thousands to go get PTSD effectively. Um, Hundreds of thousands of young men gone sent to war, fight a war that they weren't really told what it was about, and they were lied to constantly. And then they came back with PTSD, and now we have a treatment for it, and they're still not really getting the treatment to them. And I thought that was just kind of a cruel system. They fought their ideological battle by sending all of these young men to a war that they didn't really understand, that they didn't really know what they were fighting for. They had the completely, understandable effect of coming back traumatized with all these different PTSD symptoms. And then there's a treatment out there. I think, is it the most effective treatment that we've seen out of anything else for PTSD is MDMA assisted psychotherapy?
Yeah, I would probably argue, based on the clinical evidence we have now,
Yeah.
that it is, particularly within this population where, military veterans are some of the worst responders to PTSD treatments. Whether psilocybin or ayahuasca is better than MDMA, we don't have definitive evidence on. I might
Yeah.
argue perhaps they are, but
Interesting.
we're yet to kind of see that fully come out. But in terms of the engagement from the US, and you're so right, I think having had some involvement with the military myself, and a lot of kind of connection there with my work, there is this aspect of, if you're going to want to recruit men in to do this kind of work, then you need to ensure that you've got
Right.
safeguards for them on the way out, so that they are fully supported. And we certainly have not done a good job of that. And we were talking about
Yes.
what we did in terms of Vietnam War. Well, the state of some of our men who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan in the last 20 years is
Right.
really quite shocking.
Yeah.
And that is particularly poignant in the US, where the suicide numbers among veterans are still extremely high. But there's also a lot of, other aspects that go into that, in terms of the kind of societies that they're going back into when they come out of military service. But in terms of
Yeah.
the willingness for them to engage, I think that we've actually seen reasonably good movement, particularly from the US military. Now, the veterans have formed the spearhead in some regard for the psychedelic movement in the USA, because of the amount of charities like Heroic Hearts, like Vets, like others, who have taken military veterans through various psychedelic programs and seen, in places where it's legal, in South America and Jamaica, for instance, and seen incredible results. And we've published some of those results this year, as have other groups. And then, of course, this data coming out from MAPS. Now, what that means is that, veterans are often the first people standing up on stage at psychedelic conferences and saying about how much we need to engage government to allow access to these substances. But it also means that I myself have presented my findings and my research to a number of VA Veterans Association groups within the US, and the Veterans Association is a huge healthcare and social care service that looks after all veterans who've gone through the American military system, and they themselves are running some of their own clinical trials using MDMA and using other psychedelics. So they are looking at how they can bring it into their healthcare systems. But these things take time. But there most certainly is engagement now from them.
Good. That's why I wanted your perspective, because I was reading about the amazing work that your charity does, and I couldn't be more in favor of that. I'll leave all the links down below, or anything else that you want to include, because I think it's amazing. Let's parse apart these different psychedelic therapies. How does blasting someone to the moon on ayahuasca for 15 minutes compare to 2 hours of MDMA therapy, or however long it is, compared to LSD therapy, compared to psilocybin therapy? Like, what's the foundation that unifies them, and then how do they differ?
Yeah, so sorry, just on the first one. So ayahuasca is the brew, which is between sort of 6 and 8 hours long. The one that is very short is 5-MeO DMT, which is usually
right.
done synthetically, but it's traditionally taken from the secretion of a toad, the bufo toad that lives in the Amazon jungle. And so they all have this sort of commonality of acting on the 5-HT2A receptor, which is a receptor within our serotonergic system. And that's what gives us a lot of those sort of commonality of effect in terms of our change of our perception, our mood. But they all have kind of varying differences, as you say, within their length. When we look at MDMA, actually, that is it doesn't work directly on the 5-HT2A receptor, but it does work on the serotonergic system, and that's why we wouldn't call it a classic hallucinogen, a classic psychedelic, but it does have some similar effects, and at some doses and in some people it can cause more of those hallucination-like effects. But it's more affecting our mood, doing things like changing our response to fear, and increasing, activation that's going on between various regions of our brain. Now, the differences between those different experiences can be a lot dependent on things like set and setting, right? If we think about the substances you just mentioned, there's a huge difference between going and smoking toad venom in the Amazon jungle or going to a clinic and taking MDMA with a doctor. They're very different.
I see no difference between those two situations.
Yeah, and same again. If you're doing ayahuasca or Ibogaine, say, or Iboga, the actual kind of original form of the plant Ibogaine, which comes from Gabon in Africa. That's a 12-hour very kind of serious experience. Whereas you could take something like acid and, go running around a festival and it would be completely something else. So it's all very kind of horses for courses and how people engage with them. I think we are at the very early stages of really being able to define the differences between them. We do know that there are some differences, particularly in what, we might call an entourage effect, particularly when we're talking about a number of these things like Iboga, like ayahuasca, like bufo. They are naturally derived substances like cannabis, and in that we see a variation in what they are composed of that is based off of their genome, the soil they were grown in, the sunlight, when they were picked, all these things. So they have different kind of makeups, and that can affect the trip, because we know that all those different components contribute to how we see the active parts binding to the receptors in the brain and how long they bind for and all these other things. So it's really very, very varied, which is one of the main reasons why it's really difficult for any drugs to get licensed, because of this variation within them. But in terms of thinking about something like MDMA, what we would often see with that, and one thing that is, indicative of psychedelic therapy with MDMA, is that people are reasonably conscious, they are speaking, and they're able to talk through their experiences and their traumas in a way that might look something similar to what we would think of a normal therapy session as we are now. But if we were to look at something like psilocybin, for instance, or ayahuasca, we normally are not thinking of people sitting up and having a conversation with a therapist. It's usually that someone is supporting them, and that the conversation and the trip, as it were, is happening inside, and those trips can be far more abstract and involve, more in terms of either seeing things or hearing things that might not make particular sense. And in those regard, that's where we have to consider the importance of things like integration, which is what happens after anyone's had a psychedelic experience. And we look at what happened in that psychedelic experience, and we try to think about how it might be contextualized in our lives, or in, how we might want to perceive things.
Super interesting. Really, really interesting. They're such fascinating substances. Do you think a lot of the interperson variation as well is just that, my 5-HT serotonin receptors are not in the same place as yours? So it might be that one substance works really well for me because of that particular receptor distribution that I have in my brain and the particular issue that I'm having. And that would also play a large factor in what would be efficacious for me versus your receptor distribution and whatever issues that you're having. And that's why trying different therapies and seeing which ones really work for you could be really important for someone finding whatever the thing that really works for them is.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really don't understand super well, how dose relates to trip. I've been there in ceremonies where you're giving doses to the sizes of people that you really wouldn't expect. And sometimes people are not having experiences on very high doses that you would expect to. And it's not always explainable exactly why that is. Of course, there's going to be variation in our genome, the way we express different receptors in different places. But, we also have things that affect it, like our physiology. A lot of the work I've been doing is looking at how things like 5-HT2A receptors and the whole serotonergic system is impacted by female hormones. So estrogen, for instance, we know impacts the serotonergic system in terms of the expression of receptors and its activity. Now, if we take that into account with different substances, it could very well be that different substances are going to affect us differently at different times of the month. So of course that's an impacting factor. In terms of kind of working out,
Right.
what is your psychedelic of choice? Yeah, again, I think, it's one of those things of, it's a conversation you have with yourself, right? And one thing I would always recommend is, have those conversations in small amounts and in quiet and private places, not like huge doses in the middle of, busy festivals, for instance, because that's where people can have really
Yes.
adverse reactions. And just because you have gotten on very well with a particular psychedelic, and okay, yeah, I can take a really big dose and I'm fine, and blah blah blah. And we do get better. We do get better at navigating these conscious expanding states. After a while, it's like learning to be better at meditating, right? Learning to better navigate our internal world when we're on these substances. But like with anything, it doesn't negate the fact that we might ever have a bad trip, that we might ever have a
Yes.
substance we've gotten on very well with before, and suddenly we're not having a good time, or it is, affecting us in a way that we're not used to. They're quite unpredictable, these substances,
Yes.
in that regard. And like I, said earlier, set and setting are so important. It's not all about what you're about to put into your body. It's about where your body is, both inside and outside.
Absolutely.
So, those are equally as important things to think about, as well as what is it you're about to consume.
For sure. If you're going to do any psychedelic for the first time, the Amazonian rainforest might be the second or third or fourth go. Do it in a much safer environment first, because that would freak the hell out of me. And people who do that first, I think, are they're going to experience something for sure.
Well, actually, not always. We take a lot of our veterans, and it's the first time we take them down into the Amazon, and they don't always experience something. But that's why preparation is so key. It's not to say that the Amazon jungle would be the wrong thing for you to start with. And maybe, if you're that kind of person who wants the adventure or the excitement, or you really want to break through this thing that has been affecting you, but you want to do it in a safe program and container, like the programs that we provide for people at Heroic Hearts, where we've got preparation and in the jungle with Shipibo tribes, people who've been working with these medicines for thousands of years. That could be the right first setting for you, but then you need to have made sure you've done the preparation
That's
right,
hilarious.
and you've got the safe container for
Yes.
yourself to do it in.
Yes. Very well said. I think it's very intuitive to people how psychedelics can help in a therapy situation where you're basically trying to get to the heart of some emotional issue and open it up and get it on the surface and talk about it. And then you have a substance that's kind of maybe increasing your vulnerability, your positive emotion, making you a bit more open, maybe making your brain more plastic. All of that makes a lot of sense in terms of talking through an emotional issue, a difficulty. I think that makes intuitive sense to people. What's not quite clear to me is why they're so good at beating addictions. So why does Ibogaine and I think psilocybin, why do they have such strong efficacy rates in like people just giving up heroin, giving up alcohol, giving up cigarettes? Like what's happening there? Maybe I think that's less intuitive for people why that would necessarily work.
Yeah, amazing. And it's so interesting. I just came back a couple of weeks ago from a Heroic Hearts retreat that we put on, where we had veterans who had gambling issues. Now, of course, with gambling, it's easy to think of addiction in terms of, oh, well, you're consuming this substance and it's giving you these changes in your brain. Well, with gambling, obviously it's not that. So when we think about addictions and what they are, one of the most amazing things I find with psychedelics, and one of the most amazing things they've taught us and taught psychiatry is that these symptomatic effects that it has in terms of helping different disorders have shown us that these different disorders are not so different, and many of them are rooted in very, very similar things, and that is namely trauma and trauma that occurs to us predominantly in our childhood, and also how it basically allows us to then reimagine our relationship with how we respond to certain traumas, and that then enables us to think about why we're using certain substances or certain behaviors in an addictive way, and then be able to kind of move past it. So it really is this ability to go and reimagine these traumas that also helps these things to be able to influence our addictive behaviors, because addictive behaviors like depressive behaviors, like anxious behaviors, are so often rooted in this. Now, we do know that obviously we have a change in our brain physiology after we take psychedelics, which affects, the neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And one of the things that we know with addictive behaviors and, like I say, PTSD and other things, we get this rigidity in our brain circuitry. We get this inability to kind of change our behaviors based on the fact that we've got very strong connections in certain areas. Now, they could look like ruminating thoughts, but they can also look like addictive behaviors within our reward circuitry and, dopamine seeking behaviors. So we also have the opportunity to disrupt this during the acute phase of the psychedelic. Now, in terms of its power for kind of changing our addiction to things like opioids, now that is one of the more promising areas that we're seeing in some current clinical trials that are ongoing. Now, these have mostly been using Ibogaine, which is the psychedelic that is from Iboga from Africa, which is a very long-lasting and powerful psychedelic, and that actually has some other kind of interesting mechanisms that may be doing even more to help, because we know with opioid addiction it is one of the more difficult ones due to the effects it has on opioid receptors in our brain, which is what makes it so ingrained in its persistence.
Right. Super interesting. I'm not sure people necessarily know that addiction is like rooted in trauma. I think maybe there's an idea that's like, oh, that's just like in my brain because of my behavior from the last year of like engaging with that drug and then reinforcing those circuits, and now I'm stuck in that, but it's probably not linked to emotional issues in my past. That's super interesting. I was really reading on the Iboga tree yesterday. I find it so fascinating. I'm sure you're aware, but there's entire religions in Cameroon based on this, like praising and really having rituals around the iboga tree, and they would have 12 to 24-hour highly religious ceremonies based on taking ibogaine and doing this ritual drumming and like what I can imagine is a very intense experience. But the iboga tree is like sort of the key pillar of a lot of these Christian sect religions in Cameroon and Gabon, which I didn't know. I find the relationship as well between psychedelics and religious cultures and traditions a super interesting area that's existed
Mhm.
for so many more thousands of years than any of the West has been really playing around with these substances in different ways.
Oh yeah, hugely. Very, very much so. And I think it's fascinating. We also have like the Santa Daimon, for instance, religion, which they have ayahuasca as a common practice, but they are Christians and they have various beliefs
Yes.
around how the ayahuasca connects them to their Christianity. And I think it's pretty undeniable, right? When we look across, we are both here from a part of the world where we had sort of Celtic and Druid religious practices, where I think it's quite obvious from some of what little we do know. Thank you very much, the Romans, but what little we do know that survived from these times, that psilocybin mushrooms
Yeah.
would included in these ceremonies, that they're seen on various bits of metalwork that are left from those times, and they have been kind of a lot of the stories that have come about from things that are quite likely to have been induced from psychedelics have ended up as stories in the Bible. So it's
Yes.
we're very, very good at thinking at forgetting the true length of the arc of history, and how all of these
Right.
we are not the first people to have picked up the mushroom and gone, oh wow, this is incredible, maybe we should use it for treatment resistant depression. Like, it has been part of our culture and part of our ceremony. I think ceremony is so
Yes.
interesting, and you don't have to take a psychedelic to be part of a ceremony, right? When we think about things like dancing, like singing, like drumming, we see physiological effects in our body which appear to be sort of healing in some regard, be that from like frequencies of energy, be it, from being in community. We don't know, but that's what is so interesting, I think. And when we look at, and one of the things we'll be able to
Yes.
do more in time is looking at what comes out of the clinical trials, where we've taken a single person and we've taken them and given them a psychedelic and we've put them in a room with a therapist, and they've come out, and obviously we get to sort of measure that improvement. But when you compare that to people who've joined a group and gone and done a ceremony, in terms of the kind of improvement, do we see more happening from those ceremony spaces? And what is that about? They've essentially consumed the same substance,
Yeah.
but the sense of the community and the ritual makes it potentially easier maybe to integrate these things into our lives when we come out. Maybe it's part of that kind of the
Yeah.
practice of singing, etc. It's all fascinating, and there's incredible work now going on to try and tease apart these particular differences, and where they might be. What is the secret source of the perfect psychedelic treatment?
Right. I mean, it does make sense to me in terms of how the brain places importance on things. That if you were to go 10 minutes down your road and go into some therapy office and be given any psychedelic substance, that getting on a flight to the Amazon rainforest and like interacting with these shamans, like there's just going to be so much more importance and significance that your brain is placing on that occasion. We have the Hawthorne effect, which is a well documented thing where the intervention itself has an effect on the therapeutic outcome. So I think they've done studies with IV drips where just the fact of having this kind of thing that you wheel into the person's office or into the patient, and you kind of drip it into their arm, just kind of even the dramatic nature of that adds to the predictions that the brain is making about what sort of effect it's going to cause. So having all this drumming, being around all these shamans, being a part of such an ancient experience, it is just going to have a completely different effect. And maybe I was wrong to say it shouldn't be the first one, because it just seems like that's going to stage 10 right away. But, it's people like you have done a lot of the amazing work in making sure it goes right, and you know how to set people up for it, and all the boxes to tick, and that's also exciting. I need to go up with you on one of these heroic hearts trips, because I think they sound like a lot of fun. I'd love to document the process and possibly engage in it myself. I think that would be a really, really fun project.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is so wonderful. And, beyond what you're just saying there, when you think about these retreats, they are these opportunities, I say, to step outside of the world that you're living in, which, it's always easy to chill out when you're on holiday, right? But it, allows us to get some kind of perspective with which to review our lives. But furthermore, they're often conducted, like you say, in the Amazon rainforest, often in these beautiful places. And one of the things, not only do we see psychedelics improve our depression, anxiety, PTSD, et cetera, they also improve our connectedness with nature, and our, how much we want
Yes.
to go outside and engage with that. And as human beings, we have to sort of remember we are wired up to live in a natural world. And the more we isolate ourselves from that, the more we do see, people struggling with regulating themselves.
Yes.
And we do know that, being in nature, actually, that you can get prescribed going into nature in Japan that as a mental health treatment. We know that it
That's awesome,
actually
isn't it?
works. Yeah. Yeah, that you get forest bathing,
Last
send you to the forest.
That's so cool. That's so cool. Grace, this has been so much fun. I think these topics are so interesting. And I really do think the work you do is amazing. I'll leave all the links below to any of the work you do so people can check it out and support you in any way. I'm really curious what you're most excited about in the future of psychedelic research. We've mentioned a bunch of therapies here. There's so much interesting work going on. What do you think, like 10 years down the line, is going to be like, holy crap, this is amazing? The potential for widespread positive effect here is huge. And it's the thing that personally excites you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge amount that can be done sort of culturally and socially, and I kind of can't wait to see sort of certain people who are very kind of in a rut and stuck, maybe they don't get sort of diagnosis for any particular illness, but I've seen incredible power of how this can kind of turn people who are in a bit of a rut in their lives around, and I think we're going to see more and more of that happen as these things become more available. But the thing that makes me really excited, and we haven't even touched on it at all in this, but when we look beyond the mental health effects of psychedelics, we've spoken a little bit about how these substances can improve plasticity and neurogenesis, the sort of growing of the brain and things. Well, then what do they look like if we put them into things like people, for instance, who've had strokes, people who've got traumatic brain injuries, people who've got neurodegenerative disorders? Can we perhaps not just halt these, the further worsening of symptomologies, but can we actually potentially improve them? And there is early case study evidence, and I've been lucky to be privy to even some of it myself, of people who've had traumatic brain injuries or strokes and lost, cognitive function or even movement, and have seen some be regained from the use of psychedelics. Now, that's not to say that that is proven out in any way, but there
Really
are early
interesting.
signs and early research going on that within 10 years' time, I think we could be there potentially with some treatments using psychedelics.
Super interesting. I've thought for a while, and I've said this to people, and they think I'm joking, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. I I look at my nana, who is 90 years old now and has really no quality of life. She's been at home by herself for a long time. I think it's cruel that we don't pump these people full of edibles and psilocybin on like a daily basis so that they have some life satisfaction, so that
Yeah.
so their joints hurt less, so that they can actually engage with, the TV a bit more, like what would you, and I say pump them full of, you would obviously be able to dose it really properly then for the body weight. You'd be able to like give them exactly what they tolerate well. Would that not
Mm.
just give old people more life satisfaction? Would it make them hurt less? Would it make them feel more?
Well, I
It sounds
definitely
crazy, but
think
I'm genuinely serious.
no, and it's not crazy. And I've said a number of times, I think there's a great business model to be made in prescribing cannabis to, or, within old age care facilities, because I think it's pretty excellent in terms of
100%.
what we know for what we know for its medicinal properties are really very applicable in this age in terms of like pain, sleep, appetite, inflammation, and in terms of the
Yeah,
negative effects like memory, performance, and things, it's not really too much of a risk ratio that you have to worry about.
exactly.
for them. In terms of psychedelics, I think that's maybe something we have to be a little bit more cautious with. We know that there is, risk factors around cardiovascular health and things for psychedelics and blood pressure. So, we would want to be thinking about what was a safe dose and a safe environment for that. But definitely, I think medicinal cannabis for everybody's nana.
Awesome. We've started a new business. We'll incorporate it this evening. This is perfect. I think that'll be so nice to give them some life satisfaction right now. I think appetite there is maybe one that's underappreciated as well. It's like I remember that both my granny and my nana, they just hardly ate any food and then they kind of wither away. They become very weak because they don't have any appetite. Like that's not a small aspect that you're improving there.
No, absolutely not. Getting people's ability to be able to eat in old age is like a serious health risk. So, I know it's not in people with old age, but there's just some studies out this week in cancer patients showing improved appetite using cannabis, because again, another patient population where it's difficult to get them to eat. So I think, that there are definitely huge kind of medicinal benefits to this, whether your nana needs a hero's dose.
Right.
Yeah, not up for me to decide.
Perfect. Grace, we're setting up the new business. We're 50-50 on it. We'll talk about it after the call. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting to me. It's been a
so much
pleasure.
for having me.
In all due seriousness, in your books, the just insane level of corruption that we will get into that was being covered up and was being swept under the rug.
The man who knew too much, Professor
David Nutt, the government's chief advisor on drugs policy, has been sacked
by Home Secretary Alan Johnson. Now it's predicted many more of his colleagues will resign in protest at the move.
Zero correlation between the harms of drugs and the drug laws. Billy's mother said, well, my kid is having like 1,000 fits a month. She couldn't get medical cannabis here, so she went to the America. She got cannabis there, and it transformed him. He went from thousands of fits a month to 0 fits a month. I am certain that tens of, maybe hundreds of children with severe epilepsy have died because they can't get the medicine, or the parents can't afford the medicine. So I think it is outrageous. And